fear of failure is something that's actually, I would think, is fairly common in our personality. But fear of failure in that environment is incredibly debilitating if you let it be. The best thing I can say is own up to it. Own up to the mistake, because the solution begins once you recognize that the mistake has been made. But he had 3 questions, which I always thought were really good. Do you have a plan? Is it working? And are you ahead or behind? You can't let that paralyze you from making decisions and moving forward.
Hello everyone, this is a new episode of Making Mistakes, Breaking Boundaries. This time we're with Dr. James Reilly, a former US NASA astronaut who made more than 850 hours in space, 3 space missions and 5 spacewalks. We're going to talk about mistakes on Earth and outside of Earth, how critical it is to learn from them, as it sometimes can even cost in human lives. So let's get started. Dr. James Reilly, very good to have you with us today.
Thanks, Rez. I'm pleased to be here.
So before we start, maybe 2 words about who are you in addition to this?
Okay. So my background is I'm a geologist, geophysicist, and so I worked in the industry for about 17 years and then joined NASA in 1995. Worked there 13 years with 3 missions. One of the things people assume is that you're just flying space missions, but we're not. Most of what we do is actually engineering and program support for different vehicles, and then also mission support for other missions that are flying. So most of my time was actually spent doing other things. And for me personally, it was very much of it was in the beginning stages of building and integrating and operating the International Space Station. And then the last jobs that I was working on at NASA before I left there in 2008 was working on the Orion vehicle, which we just saw come home on Artemis II. And my part was the landing systems in the water, because I was a naval engineer as well in the Navy Reserves, and then this crew systems part and the crew interfaces and how to develop all of that, because it's a new world compared to the last time we flew a vehicle like Orion, and that was the Apollo missions. And so now we're doing a lot more than we could have done in the Apollo missions, of course, because everything's digital these days. But the risk of failure is still there, so I've learned an awful lot from that. When I left NASA in 2008, I went to work and had worked for a couple of small startups and high-tech firms. And one of them was stencils for circuit boards, which was an interesting chemical challenge, interestingly enough, from the standpoint of what we precipitated on the stencils, which was a nickel, elemental nickel, and using it very thin layers. And then I also worked for a company that was looking at intellectual property and how to monetize it. In other words, you and I might have a patent, but we wouldn't necessarily be using it. So it was looking at how do you market that to the rest of the world. Went from there to becoming the director of the U.S. Geological Survey after working with the U.S. military on space operations, and then ran the U.S. Geological Survey for 3.5 years, which had us in D.C. And then when we came back in 2008, I went to work for Booz Allen Hamilton as what they call a senior executive advisor. So I worked across the company, all things space, as an advisor. And then I left the company just a little over a year ago, but still work for them as a consultant. And I've been now doing my own consulting work, which is what brings me to Luxembourg, in that we're looking at startups that are going to be critical to helping us achieve the Moon to Mars objectives and actually putting the first human footsteps in the red dust of Mars. We're going to have to do almost everything differently. And so that's why we're here this week, is to attend the Space Resources Symposium that was held here in Luxembourg. And so this is my first visit to Luxembourg, which has been phenomenal in my experience, and it's been a joy to be here. But thank you for having me.
Of course. Our honor and pleasure, of course, to have you with us. I'm very happy to also have the opportunity to have a talk with you. And we're actually not going to talk about heavy scientific part or things now today, but more from a different entrepreneurial, managerial aspects of things, with, of course, the background that you're bringing, which we want to learn from. So the point or the concept of this show is to talk about mistakes and be brave and not to be afraid of failure. One thing that I think exists with all of us is the fear, or is the fear of making those mistakes and actually maybe lead us to fall in love with our ideas. And when you're in space, or when you have critical missions that concerns life and death, typically, and of course, correct me if I'm wrong, but you don't have that gap to make those mistakes and to say, "Don't worry, trust me, I know what I'm doing," um, and to stay in love with that idea. I wonder, from your experience, how do you grasp that, and how do you have or develop that capability of responsibility not to fall in love with your idea and to challenge it?
So to get to my experience, the thing that and I'll credit NASA for this, of course, there were hundreds, if not thousands of people who were immensely capable, right? So immediately I'm stepping into an environment where these are all very accomplished people that are very mission focused. So it was actually fairly easy for me to look at how to make decisions about my perception versus theirs, because oftentimes they had more experience than mine. But the fact that I'm coming in from truly in a different background, than I wasn't a test pilot, wasn't a fighter pilot, wasn't, what everybody naturally assumes most astronauts are, we're actually not anymore. We come from all different walks of life. And mine was actually fairly rare in the astronaut cadre. I think there's only been 5 of us that can be, maybe 6 now, that can be considered geologists, geophysicists. But we're going to need more of that expertise when we put people on the moon, for example, for long duration, and also on Mars. But we can train, and that's the key thing. So the fact that I was a geologist wasn't necessarily the key thing. It's that I guess you could say I'm trainable, right? So I was able to listen to the people who had objectives that they wanted met. We would discuss that, train it, and move through it. When we were doing something new, one of the things that I enjoyed the most at NASA was a very collegial atmosphere for the most part, right? Just like everywhere, there's always times where you actually have to argue your point.
Right.
And the key thing there is how to argue it without becoming abusive is too strong a term, but dismissive is probably a better way, right? Because I could be in love with my idea, and it might be good, it might be 80%, but the person across the table may have a 90% solution. So now how do you recognize the value of the 90% solution versus mine? And how do you step out from your ego far enough to actually look back and go, oh yeah, that's a good point that hadn't been considered. But that's where collaboration starts, and that's the key thing. And anything as complex as missions in space, or any mission, that has a highly dynamic nature, the collaboration piece, because we all think better together than we do individually, then it always ends up with a better outcome. You generally have a much broader examination of what are the critical factors. First identify them, then define what's critical about them, and then you protect for loss of mission, loss of life. And NASA actually has a very strong safety culture for exactly that. And so how do you now put this in that rank, in the stacking? And that's where you learn to work with a lot of different people, to get to that assessment. This is critical, and this needs to be addressed as loss of life or loss of vehicle. And those you have to fix, right? So that becomes your first priority. So at the end of the day, right, going all the way through this long answer to your relatively short question is, you're assessing everything as you get there and trying to rack and stack what are the risks to the failure. And a point you brought up and fear of failure is something that's actually, I would think, is fairly common in our personality. We really don't want to fail. And so you can't let that paralyze you from making decisions and moving forward. And that's where the collaboration helps, because you can now evaluate that with others and not just in your own head. And so now the fact that you've got these different perspectives, that's the strength of a team. And the team at NASA, just like it is at ESA and elsewhere, and companies that I've worked at in all these different environments, including the academic environments, the collaboration makes the end product stronger and the decisions more sound, especially when they have critical outcomes that you need to protect against.
Nice, nice. So practically, when you trust your team, because you're working in a team, and also as a startup, as an entrepreneur, you have a team. The team might be either your company, your teammates from the company, your stakeholders, your customers, your investors, whoever they are. As long as they trust you, and as long as you gain that trust, then you can afford, or you feel more comfortable to come up and say, listen, yeah, I might be wrong, or to listen to them.
Yeah. In fact, that's when I was in leadership, one of the things I learned from my first shuttle commander, who was very, very good.
Okay.
And he actually had a management philosophy that we can talk about here in a few minutes if you want to. And I termed it was 3-question management, because he used these forms of these 3 questions to monitor, and then he put ultimate faith in his people, but then he monitored the progress. And so he was always looking for, if you were coming up short, he might come and ask if you need some help, or have you forgotten to do this, that sort of thing. So he had a very soft presence.
Okay.
And he was a U.S. Marine, which is not a person that you expect to have a soft presence. Right. So he taught me a lot about how to do that. And I've used it ever since. And it's actually a very good management technique, especially for highly motivated individuals that are working as part of the team. Because one of the hardest things to do is, of course, is to bring the team together. And so when you now have to get an assignment that you may not be making yourself, mm-hmm. that you have people that are now being assigned by, in our case, the chief astronaut, and the team that works with the chief decides what that mission is. And it really is governed by what are the skill sets that they need to accomplish the mission. And so they look at each of us individually, our training teams that have worked to get us ready to become assignable for flight. And then we go into the flight training. They all know us better than we know ourselves. And so they will deliver that information that now allows this team to be built. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be successful. That now is up to the people inside. And so when the question gets to, how do I know that my decision may not be a good one, is one where I actually listen. And sometimes listening is with your eyes, listening to the people around you, because the last thing you want is to see the face that says, I really need to say something, but then they're inhibited. And in fact, there's an example that we can talk about in terms of Columbia, where that happened at a senior management level, which probably participated in the ultimate failure, right? In that culture was breached in terms of the trust that we have, both vertically and horizontally across the structure. And building those in a non-life critical environment is somewhat different.
Right.
When we come back out into the commercial world. Right. But when you think about it, it's essentially the same thing. It's just a different outcome. You're probably not going to kill anybody, but you could kill your company. In fact, major companies have done exactly that, where leadership at the top has made poor decisions, or there's been leadership in the middle that has made poor decisions and they didn't fix it at the top, or from the sides. Then the outcomes have been bad enough that companies have gone out of business. And for startups, that's critical, right? You want to make sure that as much as possible, your decisions aid the path of discovery that you need to get your product or service to the marketplace.
So let's talk about that silent red flag. And you mentioned Colombia, and just maybe in two sentences for those of us who doesn't know what when you say Colombia, what does it mean? Maybe if you can share first of all.
So Colombia was our first space shuttle, and it flew mission STS-107. And we had a crew of very close friends on board that vehicle. And most people will recall that was the vehicle that came apart on reentry due to some damage from a piece of insulation that came off the external tank during launch and struck the left wing in just the wrong place. And then we didn't know how extensive the damage was on reentry. And then during reentry, about halfway through the reentry phase where they're in the plasma, the basically the wing failed because of where the damage was and the plasma that entered the wing, and then the vehicle came apart and we lost our crew as part of that. And it was a number of different things that came to be the failure. One was the materials in terms of how it failed, but the other one was actually a management failure at a bunch of different levels, and a lot of it is because we just didn't know where the limits were, and that's the thing that when I talk to other audiences, I talk about the margins. You have to protect your margins. And so, for example, if you're delivering food to customers, like General Mills, which is the largest cereal maker, and many other products in the U.S. and they're here in Europe as well. General Mills is totally dedicated to product quality and are absolutely adamant that if there is even a possibility of contamination in their product, they will stop it, and they will take every bit of that product out of the supply chain so that there's little to no risk to the public, because all it takes is one, and you could kill your company. And they all know that. Their senior management recognize that. And so they're very dedicated to make sure that the quality that goes out is the best possible. And so they're constantly looking at it. And so quality control is very important. And so the decision-making has to be collaborative, and they have to listen to people that, if you're the chairman of the board, you have to be listening to people from the president all the way down, because there's expertise in the plants that know where those margins are. And so the CEO might be looking at margins at their level, but the person who's on the line on the plant also knows what the margins are at their level. And sometimes those are linked. And because that person is not comfortable, the top person should be listening to that person instead of the other way around. And sometimes the ego gets in the way, and that becomes the problem. In the case of Columbia, we had a program manager that really didn't like the discussion that was coming from some of the engineers that were concerned that we didn't know the damage and could not characterize it well enough to make a decision to re-enter. And that was a very long discussion that happened after the accident. And as it turned out, the failure, because it's a composite, it's a step failure. In other words, it'll resist, but when it fails, it doesn't fail as a crack or a deformation. It basically fails 100%. That's what happened in this case. And that failure occurred because we didn't know and hadn't classified the nature of the risk in terms of mechanical impact damage. What would it look like to the leading edge? And as a result, we ended up with about a 0.5 meter by 0.5 meter hole in the wing, which was impossible to do anything about on reentry. So the only option we would have had would have been to make a decision earlier, and then there was an opportunity to fly another shuttle up to recover the crew. Would have been a lot of work, but that's what NASA's good at. They can do things very quickly when they have to, with a lot of precision, because we have the best of the best, working for us there at NASA. And I'm certain they could have come up with something that would have at least given us a chance, to get the crew back. But in this case, by the time the decision was made, it was too late.
That's interesting, because it's not just about, raising your hand when you know something might be wrong. And of course, in the Columbia example, of course, it cost people's lives. In a startup, it will cost, like you said, the life of the startup, or it will create a bad effect. But it's also to know that there's always a way out. I mean, and that is a mindset that that we can learn from. That even in such an extreme example where, if you would raise your hand, that would mean, okay, now we need to send another space shuttle into space and to spend tons of money and time and effort and so on for that. And if I just stay silent around that table, it might be working, but I know there's a chance it won't be working, and I could have stopped it, and I didn't. And it's worth, and maybe that's something to remember. There's always a safety net. There's always a solution. There's always something that can be done.
There's something you can at least try.
Yes.
And what you pointed out was one of the key failures, in that there were people that were concerned about the analyses being done and whether they were characteristic of the actual situation, because the software that they were using wasn't really designed for the situation that they were trying to model, and they had concerns. And that's exactly the problem, is that you need a senior leadership. And I'm not casting any blame anywhere here at this
Of
point,
course.
but it's really just a senior leadership that's supportive, right? That says, if you have concerns, bring them forward, right? So we can allow the rest of the team to assess it, because nobody's smarter than the team itself. We think better together than we ever do individually. And we get a broader set of perspectives and questions that are asking. And that, in this particular case, there were people with concerns, just like there were with Challenger, that the environment hasn't been tested, so we don't know how it's going to perform. And so what's the risk? And in both cases, obviously, the risk was loss of mission, loss of vehicle, loss of crew. The thing that we are absolutely we're absolutely dedicated to trying to minimize that failure. And that's the one that scares all of us. And in the case of what you just pointed out, if you have, if you're inhibited from speaking or bringing up your concerns, or they're not addressed directly, then you risk losing the concern that might have changed the outcome. Yeah. It's a little hard to say, at what point would that outcome have changed and would have been done in time. That's a separate question.
Yeah.
The question really gets down to, were they allowed the floor to bring forward their concerns?
Right.
And in some cases they weren't, and that was the problem.
Yeah. And that's a cultural thing, of course, that goes down in some cases to individuals, because I'm sure, NASA is a big beast, and in some places, the culture of, embracing, opinions, even if you're not the senior engineer or whoever you are, still you have it. And at the end of the day, sometimes it gets to very, very, very specific situations, and then it doesn't happen. And I guess, and correct me if I'm wrong, what I'm taking out of it is that you need to work hard to maintain that culture. It's not to be taken for granted, especially when you reach hard situations.
Right. And for startups particularly, you can kill your startup really fast just by making a poor decision. And that's where, and I'll brag on Technoport a bit here for a second. That's where the incubators work really well, because you have the team that they don't have within the startup that surrounds them and helps with some of the experience that has come from other startups, as well as people that are running Technoport have done that themselves. And so they recognize, here's where the failures are, here's where your challenges are going to be. Being able to get that information, because oftentimes you may only have yourself and maybe 2 or 3 other people working with you in your startup and you're trying to build that capability. You don't have that depth of experience that you come to count on, right? That allows you to get that understanding of what works and what doesn't work. What are the things you need to watch out for? The experience of knowing what the ultimate cost of failure is, and at what point do you draw the line and said, we're not stepping past that, because if it goes past that, it's going to kill our company. Those are all the decisions and things that have to be made. And it's really no different than what we were just talking about. Columbia just happened to be a larger and obviously more spectacular failure that occurred that cost our friends their lives. But it's still the same, right? It's a lack of depth of participation in the decision-making process in some cases, the ability to look at people that have a different perspective on the problem, that might have different ideas on whether this is critical or not, what are the possible solutions. And that's actually where the team comes in to greatest effect, is that when you recognize a problem, your team will be looking at it from all their different perspectives. And that's where, we call it whiteboarding, so you have a whiteboard up here and you throw everything up on it and then you start making sense out of it.
Right.
AI is going to help us a lot with that, I think, but it can also be a weapon. But the fact that we're all looking at it and we're all thinking about it, but we're all coming from different perspectives, allows us to get to that the key conversation that we have to make decisions on. And is this a decision that we want to make to take us forward? Are we addressing the risk properly? What happens if this fails? What happens if this fails? If we can't do this, what happens? Do we have the funding that allows us to go forward? One of the most critical things startups have to deal with. Entrepreneurs are always, worried about, do I have enough money to make it? And that's a big challenge for them. But all those things are questions that all have to be answered. And usually we're with a very small team.
Talking about team, I have to ask because, well, there are lots of discussion about what is a team. I have my answer, but I wonder from your perspective, when you say a team, how would you define it? How would you differentiate it from, other types of groups of people?
In our case, we all had a common objective. And so that helps with the team dynamics to start, because this is our job, is to run this mission and have it be as successful as possible.
Right.
And we all want to excel, right? So you first have to accept that you're part of a team.
Right.
And it was easy for me because I always knew it from the day I walked in there. I am not the smartest person in any aspect of what we did in space, right? All these other people are coming from operational backgrounds. Mine was operational in many ways for the things that I was doing, but it was different. Sometimes the outcomes could be critical, same sorts of things. And so you get into the science of decision making. The same things I was dealing with in the petroleum industry when I was working in the rigs in the North Sea, for example, are very similar to the decisions and things you have to make when you're flying a jet or you're flying in space. All these things have the same sorts of mechanisms and mechanisms of failure and mechanisms of success. But the hardest part in a lot of ways is putting that in that perspective. But by being part of, for me personally, being in the astronaut corps, I'm working with truly remarkably accomplished people every day, right? And I looked at it and I was just like, I'm the dumbest guy in here, right? And by coming at it from that standpoint, I had the ability to sort of sit back and listen and learn. And I mentioned my commander on my first flight, a guy named Terry Wilcott. Terry was one of the best managers I've ever seen, and he did it seamlessly. And so he's got people he doesn't know. He really didn't know me very well at all when I was assigned to the crew. And I wasn't a fighter pilot, wasn't a test pilot, wasn't any of that. I was a geologist, geophysicist that came out of an industry and didn't have any military experience at the time. And so what do you do with that? And so he had to make that decision. So the interesting thing was he gave me one of the most critical jobs on that mission, and that was the logistics between the shuttle and the Russian space station Mir. And so I had to work with our team on the ground and also the team on orbit to coordinate transfer of over 9,000 pounds, roughly 4,000 kilograms of equipment, about 1,500 different items. And we had to do it all within about 3 days of getting everything over and everything back, including 2 astronauts, one going up to Mir and the other one coming home. And he gave me that job. And the thing that I appreciated about him most was that he was very quiet. He would monitor performance, all the way around. But I never had to directly report necessarily on my performance. I would, because periodically we would have meetings and say, how are things going? But he had 3 questions, which I always thought were really good, that he used to monitor performance.
Right.
And he would probably never admit to this, but this is how I boiled his philosophy down. And it was, do you have a plan? Is it working? And are you ahead or behind? Right. So there's a strategic question, and do you have a plan?
Right.
And in many cases, we already had a plan that the rest of the team at NASA and at Russia had put together. And that became the basis of what we eventually achieved. But then there was, the second question, is it working? Which is a performance question. And as long as I could say, yeah, it's working, and we're on schedule or we're ahead of schedule, that's really all he needed to know. He trusted me specifically, implicitly, that I was getting the job done.
Right.
Of course, he knew because he was quietly monitoring behind the scenes. But he left me to do my job to the best way I could do it. And if I needed help, then it was, are you ahead or behind? And if I could say we were ahead, then everything's fine. But if I was behind, then he would want to know what it was. And in the one case where we were behind, it was because something had been shipped, was sitting in bonded storage waiting for somebody's signature. Right. And that signature was late. It just wasn't getting done, even though multiple requests had been made. And so he found out what that was, and next thing I know, he apparently had gone behind the scenes, achieved the getting the person that was not signing to sign the document, so now it could be released. Now it's in the logistics stream to get manifested on the shuttle, and it solved my problem. But he did it very quietly in the background. So the moral of that story is it's not me achieving, it's the team achieving. Because Terry never took credit for any of that. It was after the fact that I realized he actually was out there doing it, but he did it for the benefit, first for my benefit, and second, and most importantly, it was for the crew's benefit. Because if I failed, the crew failed, and that was actually the only thing I feared. The rest of the dangers and everything else were a lot easier to manage, but fear of failure in that environment is incredibly debilitating if you let it be.
Question about what happens when mistakes does happen. We're all at the end of the day humans. Whatever the reasons that we just talked, either justified or not justified, but mistakes are happening, and that's okay, and they will continue to happen as long as we keep on doing something, and definitely something new and innovative, of course, and so on. What would be your biggest tip to handle a situation when a mistake happened, and then what?
The best thing I can say is own up to it. Own up to the mistake, because the solution begins once you recognize that the mistake has been made.
Right.
And then the discussion needs to go to, well, how did it happen? What can we do to fix it, if that's the question that needs to be answered? Or what, in our case, many times it was, what can we do to prevent it from happening again? And so capturing the lessons learned was something we did after every mission. In fact, one of the things that we did flying the T-38, which is our high-performance jet that we flew pretty much everywhere, there was one of the people, as a very senior pilot, would get out, and I had just a few hundred hours by this point.
Okay.
But he turned to me as we're walking across the ramp, and he says, "What could I do better?" I'm looking at this guy. How am I going to answer that? You've got 10,000 hours in this aircraft, But he asked me, what could I have done better? And that was a lesson that I never forgot. Is that no matter what I was doing, I would look to the people around me, particularly our training staff, and say, what could we have done better today? Right? What can we change to increase our efficiency? What can we do to get a shorter time devoted to a task? Because if we could shorten that task and maybe one or two others, well, you now have a new task you can put in there, and that time and space is expensive. So now you're making money in space in the way we measured it. But you think about it in the startup, you're doing the same thing, right? What can we do better? Right? Always ask that question, and ask of the people around you. And if in senior management, when I've been in senior management, that's something that I always tried to ask. And sometimes the situation works really well, and then other times it doesn't, and that it depends an awful lot on culture.
Okay.
And where it didn't work as well was in a culture of politics.
Okay.
And politics really has no place in business, has no place in exploration of space. But unfortunately, politics shows up everywhere. And it's hard to get away from.
Even there.
And some people think that politics is the end of everything, but you have to think of politics as really just another form of ego, and it can get in the way. And so if you can divorce what you're doing from the political, you'll become much more efficient in terms of being able to get stuff done. But unfortunately, that's not always the case.
That's a very strong lesson, because at the end of the day, I think it's about being confident enough of who you are. So if we take the example of that pilot that you mentioned, so as you said, just on paper, obviously this is a well-experienced pilot and knows what he's doing. Still asking you as a someone who's new to that business for feedbacks and reject, he knows his position. I mean, he's confident enough to get the feedback, a bad feedback if needed. It's not going to change who he is or whatever. He's confident with the way he's doing. He's not going to say, I'm not deserved to be a pilot anymore, or whatever it is. Not at all. It's just for him to really genuinely wanting to get better and to improve. And as you said before, because it will serve the goal, it will serve the purpose. He needs to be better, so the outcomes will be better. So he shows his responsibility for that, and asking whoever he can, and of course someone who was there with him in the airplane, for feedback.
Yeah. So all of us, and as soon as you build a team, you have people that have different perspectives, and it's the different perspectives that oftentimes are the strength.
Right.
Coming in as a geologist, geophysicist into the astronaut corps, my perspective was oftentimes far different than the folks that came out of the military as high time tactical jet pilots.
Right.
And so we would have a discussion, and my opinion might be completely different. But the fact that we would come at it from different directions gives you a better, and I think in terms of geometry, a three-dimensional view of whatever the challenge or problem or task is in front of you. And that's what I was hearing from that senior pilot. He was actually a senior astronaut. I mean, one of the most senior, very famous guy. And the fact that he asked me that just blew my mind. I was just flabbergasted. This guy's asking me. But I got to thinking about it, and the fact that while he's flying, I'm sitting there observing. Right, same thing the other way around. And so I expected feedback from him. I didn't expect to be giving him feedback, and of course, I didn't have anything I could say at the time. But there was a couple times when we were flying, and he was making decisions, and I didn't understand what he was doing, and I could just ask him. I said, "What were you doing here, and why were you doing that?"
Right,
and then he would tell me, and then then I would learn something back from him. I don't think I ever supplied him any good information, but I learned an awful lot from him because it builds, if nothing else, a communications channel.
Yeah.
That ability to talk at levels that you wouldn't otherwise, because he's in the hierarchy up here, I'm way down here someplace.
Right.
But what he just did was he just leveled that,
right,
which I thought was a really good management technique, and allowing me to ask questions is really what it came down to.
Yeah.
And otherwise, I would be intimidated to even ask the question, because you'd be afraid to show just how ignorant you were of the subject.
Right.
And that goes into the whole fear of failure. You don't want to look stupid. You don't want to be stupid. You don't want to do something stupid. All those things wrap up into fear of failure.
Yeah. So we're talking about critical thinking and the importance of it. How do you see it? What does it mean to you when talking about critical thinking? Why is it critical to have that critical thinking?
So when we think about critical thinking, what that means to me is somebody who's thinking and examining something from a different perspective. And the fact that, for me, when I look at something and it doesn't seem to make sense, I'll usually default to a couple of different methods. One is just math. Does the math make sense? And you find out pretty fast that math doesn't make sense. And so the critical thinking is applied there, obviously. And there's lots of examples of that every day that you see. One that I've always liked was a quote that came from General George Patton, who, of course, was very popular in this area during World War II. And it's reported that he said it's something in association with the assault on Bastogne, where he moved the Third Army faster than any other army has ever been moved in history to relieve the troops that were holding the crossroads area in Bastogne, and was remarkably successful. But he has a quote that I've always liked, and that quote was, if everybody's thinking alike, then somebody isn't thinking. In other words, somebody's not thinking the way they would normally think, and you're getting into groupthink, right? And then what you need is that person who's just sitting back and listening to it, and might say something like, I've got a question I just have to ask, or let me ask the dumb question, which is actually a phrase I use a lot. And a friend of mine who is a very senior and very famous astronaut would say, I'm just asking, right? But then you always listen to what came next, because that caused you to think differently. And it's that question that actually leads to success in a lot of ways, because quite often they're seeing something that the rest of the team hasn't. And if you ignore that voice, or you don't listen to that voice, or you discount that voice, sometimes you do it at your peril, whether it's your economic peril for a startup, or in the case of George Patton's troops, it was, it could have been very disastrous in terms of the effect when engaged with the enemy in that battle. For us, it could be that you're forgetting the margins, which we've talked about. Forgetting the margins can be critical to your company, whether it survives or not. Or in some cases, like where we were operating, it could be critical to your survival. And that's exactly what George Patton was saying. Always think outside the box, listen to the people that are thinking about things differently, because their perspective oftentimes provides something that you haven't thought of, and it might be a critical piece of information.
So, listen, we need to start, wrapping up. And I have a question that I'm asking because we are at the Automobility Incubator, so it's all about mobility. If you were a vehicle, what kind of a vehicle would you be?
I'll shape it with where my interests lie a little bit, and I can see what's coming in the future. And that a lot of what we take for granted today is changing very rapidly. Autonomous vehicles are going to be here before we know it. And so you'll basically get in a taxi, for example, and there won't be anybody in the front seat. It'll be driving itself from place to place. There's a lot of assumptions about what has to happen to be able to do that effectively and safely, because as long as you have people involved, we're amazingly competent at finding incompetent things to do, right? And the range of things that humans can make as a decision are outside the scope of a lot of digital programs or different or digital capabilities. And so managing that is an interesting one. It gets into risk analysis, so you're dealing with things that are somewhat intangible, but minimizing the risk as much as possible. And I see that coming because some of the models, which are, all wrapped up under the popular term AI,
right,
allow us to do that now. And so we can now put a lot of the decision-making that we would carry with us, like asking the great questions that Terry asked. You can now build an AI capability that asks that all the time and will evaluate what it's seeing and what is effectively large language models and everything around you. So when we talk about mobility, being able to characterize that that volume, if you want to think of it that way, of the human experience that a digital system, especially when you get to digital twins, can incorporate, is probably the first time in history we've ever had that capability, where it can now deal with intangibles in the way we think and operate that it's never been able to assess before. And so it's an exciting time. And so I would expect to see from space, which is my experience, of course, is that we'll have a lot more autonomy operating with us than ever before. In fact, things that have never been done before. Just one example, and it's a small example, but it illustrates how things are changing, is that all the rovers that have been on Mars, except for the last one, Perseverance, have all been commanded from the ground. In other words, here on Earth, somebody was in an operations center, and most of them were in Denver, coincidentally, that gave the commands to the rover to go to this place. Well, with Perseverance, the Jezero crater landing site was so complex that it was actually very difficult to get precision in the navigation on entry to know that you're going to land within this very small area. And so what they did was they put a digital map called a terrain relative navigation map that was built by the U.S. Geological Survey, the survey that I ran for 3.5 years. And what they did was that they measured distances, precise distances between every feature that was within the landing ellipse, so that no matter what was happening on entry, as soon as the back shell, the heat shield, dropped away, then the camera started looking at the direction, the vector of entry that Perseverance was flying, and what was in the landing ellipse that was now shrunk to where it was headed. And then it now was able to calculate where is it going to come to a hover and then drop Perseverance down onto the surface in an area where it wouldn't be impacting these rocks, which would be mission failure. But the beauty of that is that because it could do that real time with the onboard logic and the digital precision of what was delivered from the USGS team, there is an onboard navigation capability that now can fix Perseverance where it is relative to all these, we call them fiducials, known places on Mars. And it can now say, okay, well, I'm here. And then because it can now fix its position and its heading, it can say, well, tomorrow I want to be over there. So it can just now go. So it's a 300 or 400% multiple of what was done with Curiosity, which is essentially the identical lander, but it doesn't have that capability. So this new digital capability that takes advantage of onboard processing and autonomy is a force multiplier. But when we go to the moon to stay for long durations, and particularly when we go to Mars, we're going to have to depend on autonomy, because if you're wanting me to walk over the hill to go pick up rocks, I'll be happy to do it as a geologist. But actually, the most efficient one would be to send the rover over the hill, and it starts examining everything I would be looking at in the manner that I would do it, and then now looks at it and says, okay, well, these 4 places are places of interest based on what I can see, and then it sends it back to me or back to Earth or wherever the decision gets made on where are we going for the next 10 days, for example. And all that now becomes communication that comes from autonomous vehicles that are driving themselves to places. And pretty soon we'll have, our freight trucks that'll be all operating almost like trains that don't have conductors anymore, drivers on the vehicles.
Yeah.
And there'll be the logistics chain. And I can see that coming. But that same logistics chain will work on the moon, work on Mars. So all that's happening in the background, and we're using the humans for the things we really need the humans to do. And that'll be a first, because one of the biggest challenges we had with the International Space Station was that crew time, the available amount of time that the crew could operate on something. A lot of it was taken up just in maintenance. And they weren't doing the science, which is what the laboratory is for.
Right.
But now we're changing that. We're turning that around. And all that's happening because of things that are happening like right here at Technoport, where you're allowing people to go out there and push those limits, push the boundaries of our knowledge, further out. And our customers, of course, are, organizations like NASA, ESA, and the space agencies, because we're doing things we've never done before. And we're going to have to change our paradigm on how we operate and take advantage of the mobility capabilities that are being examined here today, that will allow us to actually have an affordable presence on Moon and Mars. And that last part's really critical. It has to be affordable. If we do it the way we're doing it today, it will be so expensive we'll never do it. It has to be done differently, and almost everything differently, which the good news is that'll build an industry back here based on what it's doing. And even more critically, if you want to think of the planet, then we will know how the planet works better than we do today, because what we're going to have to do is build a life support system that operates just like the planet does. Regenerable, recyclable. We have minimal waste, and we reuse everything. It's the only way we're going to be able to afford it. But that, you step into that's a whole other topic, but it's a really interesting one. It's one that I'm fascinated with, because we're trying to get an idea of what would a digital Earth look like, a truly digital twin of all the systems on the Earth. And the problem is we don't know. We don't know the Earth with enough precision to be able to do that. So there's no way we can actually build that yet. But that's why we invest in space, and that's why Technoport is here.
Wow. Dr. James Reilly, this was super interesting and inspiring conversation. Thank you very much for that.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Rez. It's a pleasure being here.
Thank you. And until next time.
Absolutely. Let's make sure that's the next time. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Oh, my pleasure. Yeah.